I'm finding that I'm trying to spend less and less time on social media and Facebook. I just feel like anytime I open it up, it's just the worst of the worst that you're seeing of the world. And I think, I don't want to see this anymore. But it seems like lately when I do take a peek and I do see, well, what's going on out in the social media world, one of the things that I've been seeing a lot lately, especially maybe because it's summer, is I follow a lot of groups and pages that have to do with the Outer Banks. And it seems like every day there is somebody, usually a lot of somebodies, posting horror stories about how they're disappointed with a house or some place that they've rented at the Outer Banks. Now, some of them verge on the ridiculous. Like somebody will say, I rented this place for my family, and nobody told me there'd be this much sand down here. I can't help you with that. Right? That one's on you. But others, you think, gosh, if that is really what they were dealing with, that's awful. Like people say that, well, I rented this place and I showed up and the air conditioner didn't work, or the house wasn't clean, or the deck on the house was rotted and falling apart, and just all these different things. And sometimes you really feel for the people. Because, and I hope you haven't experienced this, but maybe you have, where in a situation like that, you've paid money, you rented this place, and you show up and you're so disappointed because maybe it just didn't turn out the way that you thought it would. You saw, the pictures online and they made it look so good, and then you show up and it's like, wow, this wasn't what I thought it would be. Maybe you try to contact the rental company and you can't reach anybody. You feel like everybody's ignoring your calls and you just feel abandoned. It's hard enough on vacation, but many of us know that feeling in our everyday life. We feel like the moment that we're in just isn't what we thought it would be. The season of life that we're in, this isn't what I thought it would be. This isn't what I thought retirement would be. This isn't what I thought my later years in life would be. This isn't what I thought my family situation would be. And we're just left disappointed. And maybe in the worst cases, we feel like maybe even the Lord has abandoned us. Because we think we're calling Him, right? We're throwing up prayers. We're saying, Lord, help us. But we feel like He's ignored us. But there is hope for you and I this morning. And that is in seasons of disappointment, God's people, us, His people, can trust that He sees our struggles. He sees what's happening to us. He remembers His promises that He has made to us. And He works in His perfect timing. He works in His perfect timing to bring His plans to bear in our hearts and in our lives. And so this morning, what can we remember when we face disappointment? What can we remember when we face times and seasons that just aren't what we hoped they would be? And so our first hope, or our first thing that we can remember this morning, is that God sees the afflicted. God sees the afflicted. When you are afflicted, when I'm afflicted, when I'm struggling with what's happening in my life, God sees me. He sees what's going on. He sees what's happening. In the beginning of our passage, we read about Jacob's sons. And so what we first read about it is Leah. We're told that the Lord sees Leah. The very first thing we find in this passage. The Lord sees Leah and sees that she was neglected. The literal word is she was hated. And so remember, Leah wasn't Jacob's first choice. He was tricked into marrying Leah. And so, up to this point, at the very least, it seems that Jacob has not developed warm feelings towards Leah. Jacob, in fact, it seems, has at best maybe neglected her. At worst, as the literal understanding of the word is, he hated Leah. And so what a time and place to find yourself in as a wife You maybe didn't ask for this marriage. Your father tricked this man into this man marrying you, and you find yourself as a part of his family, but he hates you. And I'm sure she felt afflicted. I'm sure she felt turmoil over this. But the Lord sees her, and the Lord, it says, opened Leah's womb. But Rachel, the favored wife, was unable to conceive. And so, in any time period, but especially back then in this time, children were such a blessing. They were often how the success of a family or a person was measured. And so to be able to conceive and have children, this was a direct blessing of the Lord. And so the Lord sees Leah. He sees her and allows for her to have children. It's important for us to understand that when the Lord sees in Scripture, this isn't just the Lord seeing from far away and saying, yeah, I see what's going on over there. That's not a big deal. When the Lord sees in Scripture, He sees almost always with the intention of acting, with the intention of doing something about what He sees. And so He acts on behalf of Leah. She's able now to have children. And as we read through chapter 29, verse 35, at first, Leah only sees her children primarily as a way to win over her husband. She gives birth to a son, and she understands at first, this son is, because the Lord has seen my affliction, she says in verse 32. She says, surely my husband will love me now. But unfortunately, we see that not to be the case. And so on until the birth of Judah, verse 35. It seems, though, that Leah finally seems to understand and accept that her having children is a product of God's compassion towards her. God has seen her and has been compassionate towards her. She praises God for seeing and noticing her. This is maybe reminiscent for us if we can think back to Genesis chapter 16 of Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar is sent away, sent into the wilderness, which is ironic because it's a similar situation. Sarah, up to this point, was unable to have children. She gives Hagar, her maid or slave, to Abraham for him to have children through her, and then she gets jealous and mad and instructs Abraham to send Hagar away. And while Hagar is in the wilderness where she thinks this is it, this is the end of me and my son, the Lord appears to her in Genesis 16, and she names the Lord, the God who sees me. God sees me. He sees me with the intention of acting on my behalf. He has compassion on me. Maybe it's also reminiscent for us of Jesus himself. Jesus often saw people in their pain and in their affliction, and he didn't just see in kind of an intellectual sense. He saw with the intention of acting and doing something about it. In Mark chapter 6, verse 34, it says, when he, Jesus, went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. And so we see, especially in the life of Jesus, the perfect representation of God and who he is. We see that Jesus sees. Jesus is aware of you. He's aware of what you're dealing with. We see that Jesus has compassion. He cares for you. He doesn't see you unfeelingly. Right? He sees you and has compassion for you. Mark 6:34 says Jesus taught the people. Jesus acts on what he sees. When he sees you and I, he means to provide us what we need. He means to lead God and direct us. He cares for us. And so when we're disappointed in life, when we're disappointed about where life has brought us and what we're dealing with, we remember that God sees every tear. He sees every heartbreak. He sees every disappointment. And so don't look for satisfaction elsewhere. In the beginning, especially, it would seem Leah sought satisfaction in her having children, and it was certainly a blessing. But she understood it in terms of, well, maybe Jacob will love me now that I'm having children. Rather than seeing her satisfaction in the simple fact that God sees her and recognizes the situation that she was in. God sees us. But then also, when we're disappointed, when we're struggling with where we are in life, God's grace overcomes our impatience. God's grace overcomes our impatience. In chapter 30, verses 1 through 21, we see this continual kind of back and forth between Leah and Rachel and their having children. We're told that God saw Leah, but Rachel also sees in verse 1 of chapter 30. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she envied her sister. She says to Jacob, "Give me sons, or I will die." So God sees, Rachel also sees, but Rachel's seeing what's going on in Leah's life leads to jealousy and rash decisions on her part, impatient decisions. Rachel sees God's compassion on Leah, and she's filled with envy, and she almost can't contain it. That's kind of an important aside for you and I. God can be compassionate on others without us being envious. And I know that can be hard, but we can celebrate with people when God is compassionate on them. Rachel, though, is filled with envy. She's filled with jealousy. She's angry at her husband because she thinks that, well, it's his fault. He's responsible for her not having children. And in one of the only moments of clarity in the whole passage, Jacob explains to Rachel. He says, "Hey, why are you mad at me? Am I in God's place?" In verse 2. "It is He who has withheld offspring from you." And so again, Rachel's envy finally spills over into impatience. She can't stand it. She's mad at her husband. She's jealous of her sister. And so she seeks having children through her maid. Again, it's worked out so many times before. Let's not try it again, Rachel seems to think. But again, as we've said before, the Bible often describes things without giving its approval of them. And so Rachel, she gives her maid, her slaves to Jacob so he can have children through her. Rachel sees her having children as validating her and elevating her over her sister. She seems to have figured it out, right? Even though she was impatient, even though she cooked up this plan for Jacob to have children through her slave, she thinks, "I've finally done it. I've overcome my sister." In verses 7 and 8. But Leah also shows her impatience in this situation and shows her jealousy. She also gives her slave to Jacob so he can have children through her. Imagine if you're Jacob in this passage. Jacob probably doesn't know up from down right now. What a mess that this family has found themselves in. All because of jealousy, all because of impatience, all because they're disappointed and disillusioned with where God has them in life. We then have this curious interaction between Leah's son Reuben and Rachel and Leah. Reuben is some kind of farmer, and he plants mandrakes and he's harvesting them. Now, there are some who think, and commentators say, that these mandrakes, it was kind of like a root that had these kind of hardy, leafy growths on them, and they would produce these berries, and the berries, so to speak, is what you would eat. And there were some who believed that they had some virtue in them that would help with fertility and having children. And so this would explain Rachel's desire. Rachel has a desire for these mandrakes that Reuben has grown. And so he goes to Leah, or she goes to Leah and says that she wants some of her son's mandrakes. There's this back and forth. Leah says, well, you've already taken my husband. Are you going to take my son's mandrakes that he's grown as well? Rachel then decides that she'll sell Jacob to Leah in return for these mandrakes, as if the story couldn't become more dysfunctional. One wife is selling the husband to the other wife. They're really on a roll here. And so, through this process, we're told that God listened yet again to Leah after she had gone in to Jacob. We're told that God listened to Leah, and she had another child in verse 17. Now it's important to note that it is God who effected this change in Leah's life by allowing her to have another child. One of the kind of underlying messages in this passage is that the gift of children is an act of God. It's not through any natural causes. It's not through, eating these plants that may help you have children. It's not even through the impatience and the planning and the scheming of Leah, Rachel, and Jacob. It is God who is behind this act of having children. It is God's grace that overcomes our impatience. Even when we're disillusioned about how long things are taking or where we are in life, it is God's grace that overcomes that impatience. Think of a farmer. A farmer plants a crop. He plants seeds in the ground, and maybe after a couple of days he becomes impatient. And so he digs the seeds up to see what's going on, and it's only been a couple of days, so there isn't really anything going on. And so he plants them back in the ground. Maybe another couple of days go by. He's impatient, and so he digs up the seeds to see what's going on. And there's nothing going on, because it's still only been a couple of days, and this goes on and on. Is that farmer going to see much of a crop from those seeds? Probably not. Impatience ruins that crop. It ruins the harvest. It's not our impatience that advances God's plans. Sometimes God has plans for us, and in our impatience, we want to dig it up. We want to see what's going on. We want to uncover what God is doing, but it's not time. It's His grace that advances His plans. This is reminiscent of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 6 through 7. Speaking of the role of the gospel and planting seeds, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So then, neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. You and I can often be impatient about what the Lord is doing. And sometimes that can drive us to do some things that maybe under normal circumstances we maybe wouldn't do. But it's His grace that can cover our impatience. Too often, we dangle our will in front of the Lord, or dangle our timeline in front of the Lord and say, all right, Lord, look at what all I've been doing. It's time for you to speed things along. But our impatience often leads us to grasp control away from the Lord. His grace is not dependent on our perfect faith or our perfect timing or our perfect schemes. As we'll see next, He works things out in His perfect time. And that is what we will look at the end of the passage. God remembers His people in His time. Remembers His people in His time. We read the last couple of verses of chapter 30, Genesis 30, 22 through 24. It's really about the birth of Joseph. Joseph will have an increasingly prominent role in these last several chapters of Genesis. But here we read in verse 22 that God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and opened her womb. And so after all, Rachel's in. After all of her anger, after all of her impatience, God remembers her. And it's important to know that this child who was born to Rachel and Joseph, this child wasn't born through a maid or a slave. There was no surrogacy here. This wasn't through the use of mandrakes or some other natural cause to help speed things along. This was through God's own mercy and in God's own time. God remembers his people in his time. We can even look at Joseph's life as an illustration of this point. Not to give too much away, but hopefully this doesn't spoil the story of Joseph for you. But through a set of unfortunate circumstances, being at odds with his brothers, being sold into slavery, and a number of other things, Joseph sat for years in prison after receiving dreams of these wonderful things that he would do from the Lord. He spent many years in prison. As many as 10 years perhaps, or maybe even more. Every day probably felt like God had forgotten him. God had filled his mind and his heart with all these wonderful dreams, all these wonderful visions, and yet here he sits in prison. God surely must have forgotten. Yet every delay, every day sitting in that prison was positioning him for God's appointed time, God's appointed moment. What looked like abandonment was actually preparation for what God would have for him to do. One could say that everything in life is preparation. Everything that you and I experience is preparation. What you and I go through, our disappointments, when we're disillusioned about the world, when we feel like God has forgotten us, it's really just preparation for the life to come. It's preparation for being made to reflect God's Son, Jesus. Because God does, in fact, remember us in his time. He does bring his plans to bear in his time. And so I want you to notice the bookends of this passage. Genesis 29:31 through 30:24. In chapter 29, verse 31, we read that God sees Leah. At the end, in Genesis 30, verse 22, we read that God remembers Rachel. The bookends of God seeing and remembering. And in between all of that is envy and jealousy and impatience and a dysfunctional family and just all kinds of mess going on. But what covers that is God sees and remembers. He sees and remembers us when we're disappointed, when life hasn't turned out the way that we thought it would. There's an often used illustration for life that says life is a lot like looking at a tapestry, or like a wall hanging. When you look at the back of it, oftentimes it looks like a mess, doesn't it? You just see a bunch of knots and threads all over the place, and it doesn't look like much of anything. If you were to turn that side over and hang it on the wall, people would probably think, what on earth is this? It just looks like a mess. But when you turn it over, and you see this beautiful piece of art, right? You see an image depicted, or a landscape, or just some beautiful colors and how they all fit together. You see the art. Leah, in looking at her life, she was looking at the back of the tapestry. She saw only rejection. Rachel, when she looked at it, she saw only bitterness. Jacob, when he looked at it, maybe only saw family turmoil. All of them were filled with disappointment. None of them could see the beautiful artwork that God was creating, that he was weaving together. What was he making? He was using all these circumstances to bring together the 12 tribes of Israel, out of which eventually would come the line of Judah that would eventually lead to Jesus Christ. We could even go further and think of the disciples. as they watched Jesus be betrayed and suffered and eventually die. Surely they were disillusioned and disappointed. They were looking at the back of the picture, the back of the tapestry. All they could see was the end of the line of all this time spent with Jesus. But God was weaving redemption. And the same God is still weaving His purposes and His plans for you and I today. So when disappointment comes, when we feel like God's abandoned us, He's not looking at us anymore, He doesn't take notice of us, we can trust that God sees our struggles. He sees what we're going through. We can remember that God will always be faithful to His promises. And we can remember that God is working in His perfect timing, even if we can't tell what He's doing yet. And so, friends, He won't leave us disappointed. Life may disappoint us. People may disappoint us. People, circumstances may make us feel like our life is a mess. But someday, when we finally get to turn that picture over, turn that tapestry over, we won't be disappointed in what God has made.